Hi there, this is Pastor Sherman Burkett with the First Baptist Church, and I want to welcome you to our seventh edition of our weekly newsletter and devotion. And before we jump into the devotion part of it, let me just kind of get you up to speed. April 16th is Easter Sunday, and a couple things are happening that day that you might want to be aware of. First of all, we're going to be at Boron Park at sunrise on Easter Sunday to do a sunrise service. And as the sun comes up, we're going to sing songs. We're going to talk about the resurrection of Jesus Christ. It'll be a great time of fellowship in our community. So it doesn't matter what church you go to, you're welcome to join us. And also then at 10:30, we're going to have our normal regular service here in the church on Easter Sunday. And there's going to be some special music, and we're going to have actually a special conversation about the resurrection of Jesus Christ. And it'll be a great time for you to bring friends and family who might not know the gospel or have heard the gospel. And so with that, we want to invite you out Easter Sunday, April 16th. But this coming Sunday, we're actually wrapping up our series titled Waiting on God, which, by the way, we were in part 3 this last Sunday, where we're talking about waiting on God when life is hard. Because let's just be honest, if there's anything that is as sure as change, is the fact that you and I are going to face difficult times in our lives. We have all been touched by the death of a loved one. We have all been touched by cancer. We've all been touched by financial troubles. We have all been betrayed by somebody. We have betrayed other people. We have failed in our lives before. There have just been times in our lives that things are hard. In fact, I've heard it said that you are either in a hard time in your life right now, or you're just coming out of a hard time, or you're getting ready to head into a hard time. As sure as the sun comes up, we will face difficult times. For sure, we're going to have wonderful times in our lives. There will be those times of victory and those times of fulfillment. But we all know that we have those periods of life where there is great pain and great suffering. And it's in those times we will ask questions like, where is God? Has he abandoned us? Has he left us alone? Well, this last Sunday we talked about the fact that our suffering isn't something that happens in vain, and that God is still with us, though we might not understand or see how he is working. And I want to share just a little something with you from what we talked about this last Sunday out of the text. It's John chapter 11, and it's just the very first section, and so I'll read this to you. It says, Now a certain man was ill, Lazarus of Bethany, the village of Mary and her sister Martha. It was Mary who anointed the Lord with ointment and wiped his feet with her hair, whose brother was ill. The sisters sent to him, saying, Lord, he whom you love is ill. But when Jesus heard it, he said, This illness does not lead to death, for it is for the glory of God, so that the Son of God may be glorified through it. Now Jesus loved Martha and her sister and Lazarus. So when he heard that Lazarus was ill, he stayed 2 days longer in the place where he was. Now, in this text, there's a couple of things here I think that we as believers really need to come to terms with. And I think there's a couple of things in this text that kind of surprise us. All right. What we have to realize is in all things in our lives, including our suffering, we naturally want at times when things get hard for us to pray to God, and he just snaps his fingers and then he makes it better. But the reality is it doesn't work that way, because oftentimes there's a point to the difficult things we go through. And one of the things that we need to wrestle with and come to terms with is that God is sovereign, which means in our suffering, the things that we go through in our life is because God has allowed it to happen. And sometimes we want to push back against that, and we want to resist that. We want to say, well, no. But the reality is if our suffering is outside of God's control, then God is not sovereign. But we know that he's sovereign. So what was the point to our suffering? Why do we go through things that we go through? Well, a couple things to think about today. As number one, it says right here that Lazarus being ill, his suffering, actually had a point. And the point was that it was for the glory of God, so that the Son could be glorified. You see, ultimately, everything that God does, he does for his glory. He created the universe for his glory. He sent his Son to die on the cross for his glory. He has rescued those he chooses to rescue for his glory. He's drawn you into a relationship with him for his glory. And oftentimes, our suffering is for the glory of God. We might not see it in the moment. We might not see how it works itself out. But it is for his glory. The second thing is And I really want you to notice this, what it says here. It says, now Jesus loved Martha and her sister and Lazarus. So when he heard that Lazarus was ill, he stayed 2 days longer in the place where he was. It says that Jesus loved them. And when he heard that he was sick, he just stayed 2 days longer. And that doesn't really kind of make sense to us, because I know that for us, we hear someone we love, we care about, is very sick. What do? We don't stay where we are 2 days. We go out and we go see them or be with them or spend time with them. But it says that Jesus stayed 2 days longer. Now, the reason why Jesus stayed 2 days longer, ultimately, Jesus knew what was going to happen. And he knew that Lazarus was going to die, right? And he wanted to make sure that when he got there, that Lazarus had been in the tomb for an extended period of time. So that way there was no question about what Lazarus' state was. He was dead. He was in the tomb for 4 days when Jesus got there. Okay, this was important so that way everybody knew. There was no any question about what had happened to Lazarus. And so when Jesus rose Lazarus from the dead, it was a clear example of Christ's power and his divine nature. And what that did for them is that ultimately it says that they believed. Now here's the important thing I want you to understand here, is that even though God is glorified in all that he does, including our suffering, there are two things to remember. Number one, all right, all things work together for those who love God and called according to his purpose. That is what Romans 8:28 promises us. Not all things are good, but all things work together for good. And I think that we've all been through enough tough times where we've seen where after we come out on the other side of our suffering or a difficult time, we've seen that actually it was better for us, or that in that there was something that God has done in our lives that was beneficial to us or for other people. In fact, I know that in my own life, there have been times where I have asked why God. I know that when I've struggled in the past before I went into ministry, why God seemed to be getting in the way of my career path. And I would ask, why, Lord? Why was this happening to me? And then come to find out that God had a different direction for my life, and I needed to trust in him. Right? And all of us kind of go through that. But the other thing that I want you to notice is in this text about Lazarus is the most profound verse in the entire Bible, and it's just 2 words. It said, Jesus wept. And this word wept is not this sense of like Jesus shed a couple of tears. Okay, the word wept here in this text actually kind of connotes this idea of hyperventilation. All right, it would be better that it was rendered that Jesus cried his eyes out when he saw, Mary and other people crying over Lazarus, because Jesus was moved with compassion. The point that I want to make here is that we're going to suffer, and that's just a fact that we're going to go through, and that our suffering, okay, is allowed by God, and sometimes it's even ordained by God, which is something we're going to wrestle with. But ultimately, our suffering is for the glory of God, and ultimately all things work together for good for those who love God and called according to his purpose. But make no mistake, God does not rejoice in your suffering. God weeps in your suffering. It's because we suffer greatly because of sin that God did something about it, that he sent his son, who ultimately suffered. Not just because of us. He suffered right along with us. The point was that Jesus came and he identified with us completely, was tested like we have been tested, lived a perfect life, and then suffered one of the greatest, most agonizing, painful deaths a person could. And ultimately he suffered the broken fellowship with the Father that we have experienced as he cried out, my God, why have you forsaken me? You see, our suffering draws us actually closer into the presence of God. And we're gonna be tempted to cry out, why? Why, Lord? But what we need to remember is Jesus on the cross. That's why. Ultimately, our suffering is going to draw us closer to God. C.S. Lewis says that God shouts to us in our pain. Now, with that being said, I'm not encouraging you to go look out looking for pain or for suffering. What I want to encourage you to do, though, if you find yourself in a time of difficulty and you find yourself in a deep trial, to draw up close to God. Don't push him away. Draw closer to him. Call to him. Seek his face. And he will comfort you and he will strengthen you during that time. And then there will be a time on the other side of your pain, maybe even not in this life, maybe in eternity, that you will look back and you will see God's manifold wisdom, and that you will see that God was working for your best interest and his glory. And I just want to encourage you in that. And I also want to encourage you to read this story of the suffering of Lazarus and see how it ends. And see that ultimately that God intervening in this story of Lazarus, Jesus coming to raise Lazarus from the dead, was ultimately the undoing of Jesus, in the sense that it led to his demise. It was this last act here that brought him to Jerusalem, and by saving Lazarus and raising him from the dead, Jesus signed his own death warrant to suffer himself. And so I want to encourage you to read this story, but I most importantly want to encourage you in a time of difficult pain to cry out to God, to seek his face, and certainly get plugged into a fellowship of believers who can love on you and pray you through that. I just certainly want to let you know, if you want me to pray for you, please contact me. Otherwise, please know that you were loved and you were prayed for, and I hope you have a great rest of the week. Grace and peace.